G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here with part 13 in Australia's Day of National Shame, which is my reading of Darwin 1942, Australia's Darkest Hour by Timothy Hall. It was actually Australia's Governor-General, Sir Paul Hasluck, who was at Darwin on February 19th, 1942, who when he was Governor-General was unveiling a plaque on a memorial in memory of the people who died in the bombing of Darwin. He described the bombing as Australia's Day of National Shame. So, one of my American subs, Ronald Harper, asked me didn't I have patriotic problems with being so excoriating about the behaviour and conduct of Australia's military and government and chain of command at Darwin and in the build-up to it. And I was raised on the official propaganda story, and I discovered when I was a young teenager that although society appears to tolerate lying and the marketing-driven, sales-oriented culture doesn't mind telling half-truths to people, half the truth is 100% of a lie, because one of the only successful ways to lie is to tell half the truth. The other way to successfully tell a lie is to tell the entire truth in such a way that nobody believes it. But the half-truths that the Australian public was fed, particularly during the 40 years when the Lowe Royal Commission into the bombing of Darwin was under the lock and key due to the Official Secrets Act, the propaganda, it was a half-truth or a series of half-truths sewn together, so you had this great big lie. And I was raised on it, and I'm deeply angry and cranky and resentful of the fact that I was fed a crock of shit by the educational system and the social milieu that I grew up with, or grew up within. So yeah, because to tell a lie, one must assume that the victim is too stupid to ever see their way through the bullshit. It's not possible to tell a lie without being arrogant and insulting. And, well, not to put too fine a point on it, when I was 18 I had the miserable experience of having to stand in the dock and plead guilty to having told a lie. And I found out what society does to liars when they catch them, and I decided if that's what they do, then I don't want to go through that again, so I won't tell lies. I'll tell them the truth instead, and if they don't like the answer, well, tough shit, they should not have asked the question. So like one of the things I said to poor old Ronald Harper is, how patriotically proud are you that the United States Navy shot down 60 DC-3s full of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment when they were trying to do an airborne landing at night onto the island of Sicily? Does that make you patriotically proud? And if you keep going down the track that everybody who joins the military is a hero because everybody who was in the war in the Second World War or the First World War or whichever conflict you're glorifying, if everybody who was in the war was a hero, then you raise the next generation to think the only way they can be fully human is, well, I grew up thinking the only way to be a proper man was to shoot down another aeroplane in aerial combat. I didn't really give up on that interest till I was about 21 working as a student nurse, and I found that I could never be the world's best fighter pilot because nobody was going to put up 353 aeroplanes for me to shoot down, and therefore Eric Hartmann is the best fighter pilot in the history of fighter pilots. And he will be until there stop being fighter pilots. But anyway, back to Darwin, the confusing day. This is only half a chapter because I didn't want to try and upload over 30 minutes. There was a sense of disbelief when the second wave of bombers passed over the town. Anxious, frightened people watched and waited for the bombs to fall from the aircraft, but they never came. Instead, they listened in horror to the crash 10 kilometres away as the RAAF station was pounded almost out of existence. When the first all clear had sounded, Judge Thomas Wells had come out of his shelter and, turning into the esplanade, walked quickly towards the town. His immediate concern was to see if his staff had survived. As an old gunner from the First World War, he stopped for a minute at an anti-aircraft battery and found them excited and in high spirits. He congratulated them for sticking to their guns. As he reached the post office, he met a young telephone engineer who was shaking like a leaf and told him to pull himself together. And shortly afterwards, he encountered solicitor Andrew Newell, who had just made a gruesome discovery in Postmaster Bald's backyard. There were 9 bodies, 3 men and 6 women, and Newell was able to make positive identification of only 3 of them. As he turned round to look once more at the ruins of the building, one of the men he had just identified walked through the blitzed door. There were many cases of mistaken identity that afternoon, but Newell described the experience as, quote, the worst shock I've ever had in my life. Constable Bob Darkin had beaten Newell into the post office by a few minutes. He had walked back from the library with Iris Bald and knew the moment the bomb fell on the post office that she would be dead. He covered the distance to the building in seconds, but nothing had prepared him for the horror of what he found. Mr. Bald was sitting grotesquely in a tree, part of Iris's head had been blown away, and the same fate had overtaken the telephonist Mrs. Young. Constable Eric McNabb, who was later singled out for praise by many who saw him work untiringly after the raid, arrived at the same time, and he tore the shrapnel-ridden curtains from the ruins of the Balds' sitting room and wrapped them round the bodies of the women, whose clothes had been ripped off by the blast of the bomb. McNabb found the keys of the safe in Bald's trouser pocket, and he later handed them to the senior surviving postal official, who took over £26,000 of cash, stamps and money orders. In the post office, the clock had stopped at 1 minute past 10. It was always 2 minutes fast. Senior engineer Harry Hawke gave Adelaide as much information as he could about the raid on the same circuit that Archibald Halls had been using when he abruptly broke off, then inspected the telephone exchange. It was a shambles, with door and window frames blown in and the switchboard in ruins. There were huge holes in the roof, and if the telephonists had stayed there, they would almost certainly have suffered the same fate as they did in Bald's bunker. As Hawke stared blankly at the devastation, the teleprinter suddenly started to clatter and he jumped nervously. It was only a message from the Navy advising that their telephones were out of order. Judge Wells continued his progress through the bombed streets, stepping carefully through the stones and rubble that littered the streets. Outside the administrator's house, he saw that the official car had its engine running and that someone seemed to be on the point of leaving. He wondered who it was, but was more anxious to get to his office, and he did not stop. We'll hear more about this administrator. At the courthouse, he found with relief that his staff were badly shaken but uninjured, saved by the slit trench that he had insisted should be dug in the yard. He stayed at his office for only 10 minutes, arranging for important records to be locked up, and his next call was to the police station, where he found what he called, quote, a certain disorganisation, unquote, which others described as total confusion. Nobody appeared to be in command. The station itself had been seriously damaged by a bomb, and there was not even any way of knowing if any of the police were still alive. He had only a short time to wait to be reassured on that point at least, but the police gave neither him nor anyone else in the town cause for reassurance from then on. It really wasn't their fault. Just as nobody had told them what to do in the event of an air raid to protect themselves, bracket, only later did the judge learn of Sergeant Bridgeland's instruction that policemen were not allowed to have slit trenches, close bracket, so they had no orders or idea of what to do after a raid. Okay, so the take-home message is do not rely on the police for leadership, because in a crisis they expect to be led. The senior officer, the administrator, the one who had a car with its engine running out front of his house, the administrator was Commissioner of Police, but he was not involved in the day-to-day police operations. Superintendent Alfred Stratton, he had been taken off police duties to conduct a survey for the administrator, and although he appeared for a short time after the raid, he contributed little to the organisation of his men. No show by the Commissioner, and a brief appearance by the Superintendent. Effectively in charge was Sergeant Bridgeland, the fellow who decided they didn't need slit trenches, who shortly after the second raid ended told his senior sergeant Bill McKinnon that martial law was now in force and that the police were to take their instructions from the military. Mackinnon was surprised because he had seen no proclamation and asked Bridgeland where he had got the information. Bridgeland replied that he had heard it on the wireless. Mackinnon had no reason to disbelieve Bridgeland, and even if he had, the point was reinforced very soon afterwards. Several policemen were in the police station allocating emergency tasks between themselves when the door was suddenly kicked open and they were confronted by a very drunken sergeant major in the Provost Corps, brandishing a revolver and shouting at the top of his voice, quote, "We are tops and you'll take your orders from us," unquote. There would be many more encounters with this dangerous man before the next 2 days were passed, but for the time being at least there seemed neither need nor sense in arguing the point. The Provost Corps, which was headed by a Sydney journalist and former Indian Army soldier, Captain Bernard Coleman, had a vague plan that they would sit in their shelters at Larrakia Barracks while any raid was on, and then drive into town in their trucks and take up posts to prevent looting and direct traffic. In what must rank as one of its most masterly understatements, the official war history observed, quote, "This unit did not operate in a praiseworthy manner," unquote. More precisely, it went on a drunken rampage of lawlessness and looting. There were about 80 women in the town, and Harrison, the permanent ARP officer, asked the army to make arrangements to get them out. He was told that a train would be leaving at 3 that afternoon and that he was to muster all the women and elderly at Parap Station, about 4 kilometres out of town on the main highway. The railway station in Darwin itself had been damaged in the bombing. The Commonwealth-operated railway ran over a narrow-gauge track as far as Burdham, 544 kilometres away, nearly 400 miles, and well out of the range of enemy bombers. The people to be evacuated would travel in cattle trucks, and Harrison went around the town, stopping at each hotel to requisition mattresses and sheets. By 3 o'clock, the scene at Parap was chaotic. Able-bodied men pushing to get on the train, elbowed aside women and children, or clambered over the sick to force a way onto the trucks. Got to say that again. Able-bodied men pushing to get onto the train, elbowed aside women and children, or clambered over the sick to force a way onto the trucks. The Anzac myth. The Secretary of the North Australian Workers' Union, Mick Ryan, and 8 of the union's senior officials were found trying to scramble aboard one of the trucks and were unceremoniously pushed off by a policeman. Ryan protested that they had only been trying to check some union records, which they thought had been loaded onto the train. So you got the office wallar's undying respect for paperwork, inducing the union rep to think that if he quoted paperwork, the cop would let him back on the train for the women and children to evacuate on. Just before it was due to pull out, railway staff discovered that the track had been damaged by a near miss opposite the RAAF station, making it too dangerous to ride over. An emergency gang of fettlers was rushed to the place and reported that they would need 7 hours to repair the damage. In charge of the train movement was a former clerk in the Defence Department, Major William Jackson, who was having some difficulty controlling the crowd. The Commonwealth Commissioner of Railways, George Garn, said later that Jackson had told him that he had to, quote, "put a Tommy gun on to control the people rushing the train to climb on the trucks," unquote. When the yard foreman, a man who in Garn's words was, quote, "the most harmless man you could find in the world," unquote, came to find out why the train was delayed after the bomb damage had been discovered, Jackson reacted by sending him back to the workshops under close arrest with 2 armed guards. Panic merchants do panic, don't they? By now, the Provost Sergeant Major, who had announced the declaration of martial law to the policemen, Sergeant Major MacArthur Onslow, O-N-S-L-O-W, had arrived at the station in answer to a request from Miller for military help. MacArthur Onslow had just arrived when Judge Wells came to see off the women and try to cheer them up. Quote, "He was even drunker than usual," said Wells, "and most of the other Provost Corps men, as far as I could see, were in a pretty bad way too," unquote. Several young men tried to jump onto the trucks, and this time it was Miller who decided that guns were probably the best way to deter them. Quote, "A live burst at the feet of any young man who tries to get on the train," he told the Provost Corps, and added, "but don't kill anyone," unquote. The provosts did not need any second bidding because by now they were firing indiscriminately over the heads of the very frightened crowd who were not giving any trouble at all. Said Wells, quote, "They said that if any man stepped forward they would shoot him. It was disgraceful," unquote. Almost indistinguishable from MacArthur Onslow in the way he was behaving was a Major Pye, P-Y-E, also of the Provost Corps. Bracket, both men were later arrested, tried and convicted by a military court, close bracket. And the two men seemed to be egging each other on. They were not merely drunk, but dangerously drunk, and bullets from their guns were flying in all directions. Here we come to the most brilliant bit of nominative determinism in the whole book. Constable Leo, L-E-O, Law, L-A-W. Leo is what the North Americans call a law enforcement officer. Constable Leo Law was at the station and spoke to them. It's reiterative nominative determinism. Leo Law was at the station and spoke to them, but wisely took no action. Quote, "If I had moved, I would certainly have been shot," unquote, he said afterwards. At about 5:30, there was suddenly an alarm. No siren went off, but someone called out, and there was an immediate pandemonium in the other direction, with half the people on the train running to take cover. The train immediately then pulled out of the station, and when the all clear went, it had been a false alarm, the passengers came back to get on the train again. But it never came back. The crew, instead of pulling out a few hundred metres down the track, kept going, driving at dead slow speed past the damaged section, and hurried south until they eventually reached Birdham, 400 miles away. When the train had gone, MacArthur Onslow and Pye took up duty at a picket further down the road, which had been set up earlier that afternoon to stop people leaving town and to take the pressure off Adelaide River. It was dusk by now, and the police at Parap Station, police station that is, were busy coping with the small army of evacuees who were being turned back by the picket. Suddenly there was the sound of pandemonium outside. This bloke likes the word pandemonium. It actually means all kinds of demons running everywhere. Pandemonium outside, and they rushed out to find MacArthur Onslow and Pye stopping cars and trucks and shooting out their headlights. There was no reason for this because they were all, quote, blued out, unquote, for the blackout and fully complying with the regulations. When a United States Army truck came towards them, they shot out its lights from 50 metres, which I've got to say is extraordinarily good shooting with a revolver by a drunk at night. 50 metres, shooting the headlights out of a moving truck. So I guess these blokes were demonstrating Rule Britannia or something. Judge Wells watched their behaviour but believed, wrongly as it turned out, that he had no jurisdiction over the army because martial law had been declared. In fact, martial law was never declared, and civil justice continued to function all through the war, even when Darwin became virtually a garrison town after the last of the civilians, except for a few key personnel, had been evacuated. MacArthur Onslow was at the picket when Ryan of the North Australian Workers' Union came along, this time in a utility, but still with his cronies. He was held up by MacArthur Onslow, who was threatening to blow the brains out of anyone who tried to get past the picket, and generally, as Ryan put it, quote, firing wildly into the air like a Wild West sheriff to show that he meant what he said, unquote. Ryan, however, had the measure of the Sergeant Major. That means he was used to licking up to bosses, particularly power-crazed idiot bosses. And he told him unctuously, that means he used a soothing cream to rub the message in, right? Lanolin, soft soap. He told him unctuously that he didn't want to add to his problems and that he would help him out by just quietly going past the barrier. He told him that he had plenty of petrol, which seemed to be the case, so he would not be a drag on anybody. MacArthur Onslow, who said Ryan was, quote, drunk with power and drunk with rum, unquote, let them pass. So you can soft-talk a drunken policeman waving a gun, if you're a union rep. Ryan's departure was interpreted in various ways. Major General Blake and Abbott, A-B-B-O-T-T, that's the commissioner who had the car with its engine running just after the second raid when Judge Wells walked past his residence. Abbott and General Blake wrote almost identical reports, bracket, although they denied that they had influenced each other, close bracket, saying that morale, quote, rapidly deteriorated through the Secretary of the North Australian Workers' Union, leaving town by car as quickly as he could, unquote. So, according to the administrator, it was all the fault of the union rep that everybody got scared and ran away. And one observer told an official war history researcher that although the union had been publicly advocating a scorched earth policy in the north if the Japanese landed, the only scorching done by Ryan and company was along the road to Adelaide River. So as far back as 1942 we have historical precedent for somebody called Abbott, a high government official, trying to blame the union for everything that goes wrong. That's really interesting, isn't it? Curious. In spite of that, the Royal Commission found nothing in what Ryan had done that was very different to what almost everyone else in town was doing. Ryan stayed out of Darwin for a week before returning to arrange for the closing of the union office. At the Darwin Hospital, meanwhile, the Department of Health's Chief Medical Officer for the Territory, Dr. William Kirkland, supervised the reception and treatment of the dying and injured who were brought in. He could call on 3 of his own doctors and 3 naval surgeons, as well as 23 sisters and nurses and 6 civilian volunteers. When the message was passed that all the women in town were being taken out on the train because a Japanese landing was imminent, that was the religion in Australia at the time. The Japanese had no troops to do a landing with, and they had no boats to bring the troops they didn't have. But because they had gone through the Australian, British, Dutch, American command like a hot knife through butter, it was assumed that they didn't plan on stopping. And Australia had nothing to stop them with. We had 1 Hawker Hurricane in the whole country, but it had no guns because it was only for aerobatics displays at fly-ins and recruiting and enlistment drives. And its purpose was to induce people to join the RAAF so they could get basic training under the Empire Air Training Scheme and then go over to England and bomb Hitler. That's what Australia had a Hawker Hurricane for. There was a strategy called the Brisbane Line, which we'll come to later on as well, in force. When the message was passed that all the women in town were being taken out on the train because a Japanese landing was imminent, 10 of the sisters asked to be allowed to stay behind and nurse the injured. So that'll be the end of part 13, and we'll move on with the second half of that chapter in due course. More to come. More of the truth, the whole truth, and everything including the truth, because half the truth is 100% of a lie. And I was raised on the lie, and it gives me the shits. Now I've got an opportunity to correct it, and I plan on doing just that. The Commissioner's name was Abbott, with 2 B's and 2 T's, and he liked to blame the unions for everything that went wrong. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.